The satellite image was timestamped May 12, 2026. 0347 local time. Karg Island, Persian Gulf. The terminal that handles approximately 90% of all Iranian crude oil exports, the single point through which the economic oxygen of the entire Iranian state flows. In the thermal imaging overlay that passed across 3 intelligence desks before dawn that morning, the storage tanks showed maximum thermal signature across every unit in the array. Not approaching capacity, not near full, full. Every tank at every jetty showing the same reading. No drawdown, no circulation, no movement. The loading arms on jetties 1 through 7 were retracted. Not positioned for standby, retracted. There were no vessels in the approach channel, no AIS signals within 40 nautical miles of the terminal, no tanker queue holding position offshore. The kind of absence that is not a slow morning. It is a stop system. And then the flare stacks. On a working oil terminal, the flare stacks burn at a controlled, measured rate. Waste gases bleed off at a consistent volume as crude moves through the processing infrastructure and transfers into vessels. Controlled combustion, predictable signature. The thermal red on a functioning terminal's flare system is something analysts can calculate to within a few percentage points simply by knowing throughput volume. But on the May 12th image, the Karg Island flare stacks were burning at approximately 3 times their standard thermal output. The processing equipment was still running. Oil was still being produced upstream and piped into the terminal infrastructure through the pipeline network that connects Karg to the onshore fields. But nothing was leaving. The system had nowhere to send what it was making. So it was burning the overflow into the Persian Gulf sky. A terminal producing at operational rate, filling tanks that were already full, venting excess into the dark. That image existed 48 hours before Donald Trump and Xi Jinping sat across from each other in Beijing. And here's the second detail, the one that made the first one unsettling in a specific way. The same surveillance pass that recorded the Karg Island flare signature also captured an anomaly in the South China Sea. In the waters off the Malaysian coast near Port Klang, 17 tankers that had been operating without AIS transponder signals for months, vessels that the shipping industry classifies as gone dark, invisible to maritime tracking, moving Iranian crude under Malaysian certificates of origin, had begun transmitting. All 17 within a 12-hour window. As if someone had made a single phone call, and every vessel on the network had received the same instruction simultaneously. That phone call, and what it was responding to, is what this video is actually about. The press covered the Beijing summit of May 14th as a trade architecture story. The New York Times led with tariff framework developments and a reported agreement to reduce export control friction on certain technology categories. The Wall Street Journal focused its primary coverage on semiconductor licensing and the rare earth supply chain language buried in Appendix C of the joint communique. CNN ran a panel discussion on what the summit body language meant for Taiwan. The BBC filed a diplomatic temperature piece. Tensions eased, relationships stabilized, historic handshake between 2 leaders who hadn't met in a formal bilateral setting in 14 months. The Associated Press wire that moved at 14:22 Eastern Time summarized the summit outcome in 2 sentences. Both presidents agreed to expand bilateral trade, and both expressed a commitment to regional stability. The White House readout described productive and constructive dialogue on shared economic interests and global energy security. The Chinese Foreign Ministry statement, released through Xinhua at approximately the same hour Beijing time, described a strategic communication between great powers committed to upholding the rules-based international order and the free flow of global commerce. Both readouts mentioned the Strait of Hormuz. Neither readout explained what China's public opposition to the militarization of the strait actually committed Beijing to, or against, in operational terms. Neither outlet ran a follow-up piece asking what it specifically meant that Xi Jinping publicly opposed an Iranian tolling system for Hormuz passage. The phrase, "China will not provide military equipment to Iran," appeared in Secretary Rubio's press briefing. It was reported in 2 international wire stories. It was not the headline of either. Secretary Rubio was asked directly whether Trump had requested China's assistance with Iran. He answered that no, they had not asked China for anything. That answer ran without challenge in 3 separate major wire services. 3 things were in that room that never made a headline anywhere. The status of 17 tankers that had reactivated their AIS signals 48 hours before the summit. The structural implications for the 120 independent Chinese refineries currently configured to process Iranian heavy crude. And the reaction inside Tehran's Supreme National Security Council, which met in emergency session within 6 hours of the joint statement's release, a meeting that produced no public statement whatsoever. But that is not the whole story. Here is the metaphor that makes this real. Think about what it takes to run a functional intelligence network. Not the version from films, but the actual operational architecture. You need safe houses located in jurisdictions that will not cooperate with the target country's security services. You need couriers trusted on both ends of every exchange. You need a financial layer that moves value without touching the monitored banking infrastructure. You need document specialists who produce certificates that pass scrutiny under pressure. And above all, you need a handler, a senior figure inside a friendly government who, when his own oversight apparatus asks questions, quietly looks the other way. Not forever, but consistently enough, for long enough, that the network becomes self-sustaining. That handler is not the most visible part of the operation, but the handler is the linchpin of the entire architecture. Without the handler's willingness to maintain cover, every safe house goes cold within 48 hours. Every courier becomes a liability the moment they cross a border. Every document specialist closes his operation and disappears. The entire network, assembled over 15, 20 years at enormous cost, does not get dismantled. It simply stops working, because the single relationship that made all the other relationships possible has been withdrawn. China was Iran's handler. And on May 14, 2026, the handler stood in front of every intelligence service, every foreign ministry, every oil market analyst, and every proxy commander on the planet and said publicly, on camera, with the American president standing beside him, that he opposes the operation. What Iran actually lost in Beijing is not diplomatic cover in the abstract. It is the physical, mechanical infrastructure of its economic survival. And that infrastructure has a very specific architecture that took 15 years and enormous sustained cost to construct. This is the part you will not find anywhere in mainstream coverage. Iran's sanctions evasion system runs through 3 interlocking layers, each dependent on the one above it. The first is the shadow fleet, approximately 300 to 400 vessels of various sizes that operate without AIS transponders, conduct cargo transfers at sea between vessels, and arrive at Chinese ports carrying documentation that certifies their cargo as Malaysian crude, or Indonesian crude, or Omani crude. The International Maritime Organization maintains flags on vessels known to operate in this configuration. As of early 2026, Lloyd's List Intelligence estimated 340 vessels actively engaged in the Iranian shadow network, with an average operational age of 22 years. These are not modern ships. They are old, expensive to insure, mechanically intensive to maintain, and entirely dependent on the willingness of Chinese port authorities to accept documentation that their own customs systems could invalidate in minutes if instructed to look. The second layer is the teapot refinery network. China operates approximately 200 independent refineries, smaller than the state-owned majors, running on older equipment that has been physically calibrated over years to process heavy sour crude, which is the specific hydrocarbon grade that Iran's primary oil fields produce. Heavy sour crude requires meaningfully different refining processes than the lighter, sweet crude that American shale produces. The catalyst configurations are different. The distillation column temperatures are different. The desulfurization equipment runs at different tolerances. A teapot refinery that has spent 5 years running on Iranian heavy crude cannot simply route American West Texas Intermediate through its processing train and produce the same output. The physical recalibration of equipment across a facility of that scale takes, according to the China Petroleum and Chemical Industry Federation's own published technical standards, between 6 and 12 months per facility, assuming parts availability and no regulatory complications. There are approximately 120 teapot refineries currently running Iranian crude as their primary feedstock. This is not a switch that Geopolitical can flip. It is an engineering project with a fixed minimum timeline. The third layer is the financial clearing architecture. Iranian oil payments have moved for years through a network of intermediary trading houses, entities registered in the UAE, in Hong Kong, in Singapore, in Turkey, that convert oil barrels into transactions that flow back into the Iranian financial system without touching monitored wire transfer infrastructure. The U.S. Treasury's Office of Foreign Assets Control has sanctioned more than 340 entities involved in this network since 2018. New entities replace sanctioned ones within weeks because the underlying commercial incentive, deeply discounted Iranian crude, generates enough margin to absorb the administrative cost of constant structural renewal. Now here is what the handler's withdrawal means for each of these 3 layers in sequence. The shadow fleet relies on Chinese port authorities accepting manifests they know are false. The moment Beijing signals, publicly, credibly, on a global stage, that it is aligning with Washington on Hormuz, those port authorities receive a political instruction that overrides the commercial instruction they have been following for a decade. The vessels themselves do not disappear. They become stranded, too risky to send to China, too old and too uninsured to route anywhere else at commercial rates. Within 30 days of a credible policy shift, shadow fleet arrivals at Chinese ports begin declining. Within 90 days, the vessels are operationally non-viable. The teapot recalibration window creates a 6 to 12-month period during which Iranian crude still flows because the equipment cannot yet run anything else, but the destination is permanently contracting. Every week of that window is a week that American LNG and Alaskan crude is buying the infrastructure relationships that Iranian crude will never recover. And the financial clearing network stops regenerating the moment Chinese buyers stop generating appetite for Iranian barrels. New intermediaries require new clients. New clients require Chinese refineries willing to take on sanctions risk in the current political environment. After May 14th, that risk calculation changed overnight. Iran did not lose a relationship. Iran lost the machine that kept it commercially viable. And that machine had a 15-year construction timeline and a 48-hour dismantlement window. That number is coming. And when I give it to you, I need you to sit with it for a moment before moving on. $75 billion. That is the cumulative discount Iran surrendered to Chinese buyers over the past decade, measured as the difference between the price Iranian crude received in the Chinese market and the price it would have commanded on the open global market absent sanctions. At a sustained discount of $15 to $20 per barrel, applied to exports of 1.3 to 1.4 million barrels per day, Iran forfeited between $7 and $10 billion per year, every year, simply to maintain the handler relationship, not to buy weapons, not to fund proxies, to keep the relationship alive. Over 10 years, that is approximately $75 billion in revenue Iran needed, given away at a structural discount to a partner that, on May 14, 2026, stood next to the American president and publicly declared its interest in buying Texas crude instead. Sit with that number before moving on. Iran did not pay China in cash. Iran paid China in silence, and on May 14th, China spent that silence in front of the entire world. The second dimension of this number is not financial, it is temporal. Iran's nuclear program, its missile development infrastructure, its proxy network across 4 countries, its asymmetric naval doctrine for the Persian Gulf, all of it was built under a strategic planning assumption. The assumption was that China's economic appetite would indefinitely shelter Tehran from the full weight of American maximum pressure. That assumption was not naive, it was mathematically supported for 15 years. The IRGC's joint staff calibrated its entire deterrence posture to a world in which Beijing's need for discounted oil would always outweigh Beijing's need for American goodwill. That posture is now a strategic plan built on a premise that no longer exists. And strategic premises, once publicly destroyed, cannot be quietly reconstructed. You cannot rebuild a deterrence doctrine in a quarter. You cannot reestablish the credibility of an assumption that was disproven on live television in front of every government simultaneously. The timeline for rebuilding that assumption, if it can be rebuilt at all, is measured not in months, but in years of sustained diplomatic and commercial reconstruction. The third dimension is alliance psychology. Every member of Iran's extended resistance architecture, the proxy commanders in Iraq, the political leadership in Lebanon, the military planners in Yemen, watch the same press conference, and they are running the same calculation. If China, Iran's most economically consequential protector, is willing to publicly distance itself from Tehran in order to secure its own energy supply lines, what does that signal to the PMF commander in Baghdad about the depth of his Iranian patrons' remaining cover? The psychological shockwave of Beijing's statement did not stop at Iran's borders. It traveled through every relationship Iran has spent 40 years and incalculable resources constructing. Because when the handler breaks cover, openly, voluntarily, in front of cameras, everyone downstream of that handler performs the same exposure assessment simultaneously and arrives at the same conclusion. The $75 billion describes what Iran paid to build the assumption. What May 14th destroyed cannot be assigned a price, because what was destroyed is the strategic architecture that made the $75 billion feel like a rational investment. But that is only half the story. What comes next goes deeper. Iran has 2 visible response options to what happened in Beijing. Both are fully blocked. And the third option, the one that appears to remain, is also an illusion. The first option is escalation. Intensify the pressure inside the Strait of Hormuz. Deploy additional mine assets. Seize more commercial vessels. And push the incidents to a scale that makes war risk insurance permanently unaffordable for any owner willing to send tonnage through the channel. Run IRGC fast boat harassment at a frequency that breaks the nerve of commercial operators regardless of what naval escorts are present. The strategic logic here is that pain, applied at sufficient intensity and consistency, breaks political agreements before they harden into durable policy. If Brent crude hits $120 a barrel, the argument runs, even Xi Jinping's public Hormuz statement becomes politically renegotiable. Economic pain creates political fractures and coalitions that ideological alignment cannot hold together indefinitely. Here is precisely why this fails. And the failure mechanism is structural, not contingent. Iran's escalation capacity inside the strait is a wasting asset, not a renewable one. Every mine laid is a mine that the U.S. Navy's Avenger-class mine countermeasures fleet, which is specifically deployed and configured for this environment, can locate and neutralize at a rate Iran cannot replace. Every drone launched provides targeting data that refines American and Israeli electronic warfare parameters. Every vessel seized creates another legal justification for tightening the naval cordon around Karg Island and expanding the secondary sanctions architecture around the Shadow Fleet. And most critically, every escalation event inside the strait does not weaken China's pivot calculation. It accelerates it. Because each incident confirms to Beijing exactly what Xi told Trump in that room, that China's energy security cannot be structurally dependent on a waterway controlled by an actor whose internal politics Iran's own hardline faction controls. Iranian escalation is the single most powerful argument for Chinese energy diversification that China's domestic policy community could possibly receive. Every IRGC drone that goes up inside the strait is a data point that extends a teapot refinery's recalibration timeline by one more contract cycle. Tehran escalating Hormuz is Tehran actively helping America replace Iran as China's primary crude supplier. The second option is structured de-escalation, open the strait. Enter formal nuclear negotiations with genuine verification frameworks on the table. Signal to Washington through the Omani back channel, which has been the operating diplomatic conduit throughout this crisis, that Iran is prepared to engage on terms that include real inspections and real timelines. The logic here is that a constrained Iran preserves more future leverage than a destroyed one. A deal, even an unfavorable one, keeps the institutional apparatus of the Islamic Republic intact for the next negotiating cycle. Here's precisely why this also fails. And the timeline of failure is specific to an 18-month window. The IRGC's internal political position is structurally dependent on the narrative of resistance-producing results. The organization's economic empire, its construction and logistics contracts, its revolutionary legitimacy, its recruitment pipeline, its media apparatus, all of it is underwritten by the argument that confrontation with American pressure works, and that the costs of that confrontation are worth absorbing. The moment Iran signs a deal with real dismantlement provisions and real verification, the IRGC's foundational narrative collapses. Not incrementally, within one political cycle. Because the deal will demonstrate, visibly, documentably in front of the Iranian public and every regional actor, that the resistance strategy failed at the moment of maximum historical pressure. Every moderate faction inside the Iranian government that has argued for engagement over confrontation will use the deal as institutional proof that the IRGC's 40-year strategic doctrine produced a worse outcome than diplomacy would have. The IRGC understands this. What appears from outside as ideological rigidity is, from the inside, institutional self-preservation operating with complete rational clarity. There is a third option, and it appears open. Drive a wedge between Washington and Beijing. Find the remaining points of genuine friction between the two powers. Technology decoupling, Taiwan, South China Sea claims, financial system competition, and use those fault lines to make continued China-US alignment on Iran politically costly enough that Beijing quietly reverses course. Iran's foreign ministry has been messaging this strategy through intermediaries in Ankara, Islamabad, and Muscat for weeks. This option is also fully closed. And it was closed not by diplomatic skill, but by arithmetic. The wedge strategy requires China to have a reason to prefer the status quo, continued Iranian oil dependence, over alignment with Washington. China's storage clock, 120 days of net import reserves from early March, removes that preference mathematically. Beijing cannot afford to wait for Tehran to engineer a diplomatic split between two powers. China's industrial economy is bleeding every day. The strait stays closed. The economic cost of the status quo to China is not abstract. It is calculable per day, per barrel, per shuttered factory in the Pearl River Delta. The wedge does not have time to work. The clock is already running. The operational concept for what Iran is experiencing is a convergence trap. 3 paths, identical destination. Now here is the historical parallel that no analyst covering this story has connected. In August 1990, when Saddam Hussein ordered the invasion of Kuwait, the Soviet Union, Iraq's primary patron, arms supplier, and diplomatic guarantor for 30 years, abstained at the United Nations Security Council vote authorizing the use of military force against Baghdad. Not vetoed, abstained. Mikhail Gorbachev needed $18 billion in emergency Western economic credits to stabilize the collapsing Soviet economy more urgently than he needed to protect a client state he could no longer afford to shield. Iraq, which had spent 3 decades and more than $100 billion in Soviet military hardware, building a relationship it had every rational reason to believe was structurally permanent, discovered in the span of a single afternoon in New York that great power patronage is never loyalty. It is a calculation. The calculation changes when the costs change. China's calculation changed in 2026 for an identical structural reason. Its own economic continuity required it. The geometry of that moment, a great power, abstaining rather than breaking cover entirely, sending a signal to its client that is unmistakable without being formally actionable, is being repeated almost precisely 36 years later in a different city, with different actors and the same mathematical logic underneath. And here's the detail that no analyst has pulled on yet. The detail that has not been mapped publicly is this. China's pivot does not require Beijing to do anything dramatic, visible, or formally announced. It does not require Chinese naval assets. It does not require a break in diplomatic relations. It does not even require Chinese companies to immediately stop buying Iranian oil. The structural damage is already executing through the machinery of commercial decision-making that operates entirely below the threshold of diplomatic visibility, at a pace that is slower than headlines, but faster than Iran's ability to respond. The first hidden consequence is the misread that will cost Iran the most time it cannot afford to lose. The teapot refinery recalibration window, that 6 to 12-month engineering timeline, creates a period during which Iranian crude will continue flowing to Chinese ports. Because the physical equipment cannot yet process anything else, Iranian production monitors will see tanker movements, they will see invoices clear, they will observe continued crude transfers at reduced but still significant volumes. And they will interpret this as evidence that Beijing's May 14th statement was performative. Diplomatic theater, calibrated for Washington's consumption, not a genuine policy pivot. That misreading will cost Iran the 90 to 180-day window in which a credible counteroffer to Washington might still carry enough structural leverage to matter. By the time Iranian decision-makers understand that the teapot recalibration is permanent rather than temporary, by the time the invoices stop clearing and the tanker queue at Karg Island thins further, the new American crude supply contracts will already be binding. The infrastructure will have rewired itself, the market will have moved, and Iran will have spent its negotiating window waiting for a customer who is already leaving the relationship in the only way that actually counts, commercially. The second hidden consequence operates at the maritime insurance layer, and it is already in motion. Within 72 hours of the Beijing joint statement, 3 of the 5 largest protection and indemnity clubs, the mutual insurance associations that collectively cover approximately 90% of the world's ocean-going vessels by tonnage, received formal legal guidance requests from their underwriting committees. The question was precise. Does a China-US joint public statement opposing the militarization of the Strait of Hormuz change the risk classification matrix for vessels carrying Iranian cargo under third-party documentation? The legal analysis is not complete, but the direction of the answer is not ambiguous. If China has publicly aligned with the sanctions architecture's political intent, then vessels moving Iranian crude through the Shadow Fleet's Malaysian cover structure are operating in an environment of materially elevated legal exposure for the insurance underwriters backing them. War risk premiums for vessels, flagged as potentially connected to Iranian cargo, were already non-viable for most commercial operators. A political signal of this magnitude from Beijing adds a legal dimension on top of the commercial one. The Shadow Fleet does not evaporate. It becomes economically impossible to finance because the margins on discounted Iranian crude, already compressed to their operational minimum, cannot survive a doubling or tripling of effective insurance costs per voyage. The third hidden consequence is the intelligence exposure window that the 17 AIS reactivations revealed. Those tankers did not go visible by accident. Going dark is a deliberate operational decision in Shadow Fleet logistics. Reactivation is equally deliberate, and the fact that 17 vessels reactivated within a 12-hour window, 48 hours before the Beijing summit, indicates a coordinated instruction that originated inside China's oil trading logistics network. Someone within that network understood what was coming and made a commercial decision to step away from the Shadow Fleet architecture before it became an active liability. The 48-hour gap between the tankers surfacing and the summit occurring tells you something that no press conference will confirm. The commercial intelligence inside China's independent oil trading community moved faster than the diplomatic announcements. The money assessed the situation before the cameras arrived. That is the real leading indicator, not the White House readout, but the AIS signals of vessels that had been invisible for months, choosing visibility the day before everything changed. This pattern has a direct historical precedent. When the United States imposed secondary sanctions on Russian oil exports in 2022, the Shadow Fleet serving Russian crude went through an almost identical sequence. First, commercial operators withdrew quietly and without announcement. Then insurance costs spiked across the board. Then vessel movements became erratic as owners sought new configurations. Then the effective discount required to move Russian barrels expanded from approximately $10 per barrel to $25 per barrel within 8 months, as the risk premium of the entire operation was repriced into the commodity itself. That sequence is now beginning for Iranian crude from a starting position of weaker margins, older vessels, and a smaller pool of willing intermediaries than Russia commanded in 2022. Iran does not have Russia's reserves. Iran does not have Russia's geographic optionality. And Iran does not have Russia's ability to redirect barrels to India through routes that bypass the primary choke points entirely. The degradation sequence that took 8 months for Russian oil will, by most structural measures, run faster for Iranian crude in the current environment. If Iran's strategic decision-making apparatus does not map the second layer within the next 90 days, the window for structured negotiation closes in a way that is not reopenable by political will alone. After that window, what Iran retains is not leverage. It is debris, the residual institutional weight of an infrastructure that is no longer commercially viable, operated by an organization whose identity depends on pretending otherwise. The question that follows is not what Iran will do next. The question is what Iran's silence already tells us about what its leadership knows and cannot say. Iran has not issued a substantive formal response to Xi Jinping's Hormuz statement. The Foreign Ministry released a one-sentence characterization of the Beijing summit as bilateral affairs between third parties that do not affect the Islamic Republic's sovereign rights. One sentence. From a government whose foreign ministry typically issues statements of several hundred words when it perceives even minor diplomatic pressure. The silence is not composure. It is the sound of a logical chain that has no acceptable endpoint. Because the moment Tehran formally acknowledges that Beijing has created public distance, an internal cascade begins that the Islamic Republic's current factional balance cannot absorb. Acknowledgement requires a public response. A public response forces a choice between defiance and concession. Defiance accelerates the teapot recalibration timeline because public Iranian defiance removes the residual ambiguity that is currently giving Chinese commercial actors a reason to move slowly rather than decisively. Defiance hands every teapot, refinery operator the political cover to complete their recalibration without appearing to be executing a political instruction. Concession, on the other hand, triggers the IRGC's internal political apparatus against whichever faction authorized it. Every moderate, every diplomat, every technocrat inside the Iranian government who has spent years arguing that the China relationship was worth protecting through economic sacrifice, they become institutional targets the moment the protection fails publicly. The silence protects them temporarily, not indefinitely, but long enough to maintain the factional equilibrium that keeps the Iranian state functionally coherent. The actors who benefit most precisely from that silence are identifiable. The IRGC's senior command benefits because silence preserves the operational status quo inside the strait, while internal recalibration occurs without external pressure. The supreme leadership benefits because silence forestalls the legitimacy crisis that public acknowledgement would trigger within days. And paradoxically, Washington also benefits because Iranian silence creates the space for back-channel pressure through the Omani conduit to operate without forcing Tehran into a public corner that would require a public response, which would require escalation, which would collapse the negotiating environment entirely. They are not lying. They are buying time. But buying time when the teapot recalibration clock is already running, when the Shadow Fleet's insurance architecture is already being repriced, when new American crude supply contracts are already in negotiation, buying time in that specific commercial and political environment is not a strategy. It is the convergence trap, executing itself methodically on its own timeline without requiring any further action from Washington or Beijing. The silence that Iran believes is protecting it is, in operational terms, the third option that also fails, just more slowly and on schedule. Iran built a fortress out of other people's appetites, and the appetites changed. Go back to Karg Island at 0347 on the morning of May 12th. The flare stacks burning at 3 times their calibrated output. The storage tanks reading maximum thermal signature across every unit in the array. The loading arms retracted, not a single vessel in the approach channel for 40 nautical miles. That image, a terminal producing oil that has nowhere to go, burning its own overflow into the Gulf sky before dawn, the system still running because no one has told it to stop, the destination simply gone, is the most precise picture of Iran's strategic position that any satellite has ever produced. Not a war image, not a crater, not a column of smoke from a strike. Just a terminal, full to the rim, flaring excess into the darkness, still operational, still processing, still producing, with nothing waiting on the other side. What Beijing achieved on May 14th was not a diplomatic statement. It was a structural event with a physical consequence that was already visible 2 days before it was announced. China did not fire a weapon. China did not seize an asset. China stood in front of the world and said, aloud, on camera, with every major government watching, that it prefers the optionality of American crude over the dependency of Iranian supply. And in doing so, destroyed 40 years of Iranian strategic calculation more completely than any military strike could reach. Because military strikes destroy infrastructure that can be rebuilt. What cannot be rebuilt is the foundational assumption that your most important economic relationship is durable. Once that assumption is publicly disproven in front of every proxy commander and every regional ally simultaneously, it cannot be quietly reconstructed. It is gone. And the $75 billion in cumulative discount that Iran paid to maintain that assumption is gone with it. Not stolen, not seized, not sanctioned, simply spent on a relationship that turned out to be transactional. The psychological damage runs deeper than the economic accounting. Every actor inside the resistance axis is now operating with a revised understanding of how permanent great power guarantees actually are. The resistance architecture held together, in part, because its members believed China's protection of Iran was structural, built into the geometry of global energy markets in a way that could not be quickly reversed. May 14th demonstrated, publicly and irrevocably, that it was transactional. And transactional relationships end when the transaction stops making sense for the more powerful party. $75 billion was surrendered, but what was destroyed has no price tag. The question now is, when the IRGC maps what it has left, its doctrine, its proxies, its hardened positions inside the Strait, its institutional identity built entirely around resistance, and maps those assets against the world that now exists after Beijing, does it choose a deal? Or does it decide that if it cannot keep the Strait, no one gets what they came for?